Invasion Audiobook, Part 26. Though he wasn't sure how long he'd slept, it may have been for some hours. Jacob and the other survivors, having made it back alive from their earlier massive Tet-style operation, where were physically broken and battered, having had encountered and taken by surprise small KPA elements at both a fringe combat outpost and two scattered checkpoints further south, upon a road earlier traversed, going into day number 2 of the overall invasion. Joseph, too, had once passed that road, whereupon those checkpoints had recently sat. It now currently being utilized as a local supply route for the local coalition forces of both KPA and PAP troops now occupying the Ann Arbor area of operations, or AO. George, badly wounded and resting, had passed on his operational command to Tony, who now presided over the remaining 41 men out of the original 150. Many of these men were wounded or had sustained smaller injuries. Some could be returned to duty, whereas some would need more long-term care due to their current conditions. George, though wounded, fully realized that the local forces, having been caught off guard by the moderately sized AO-wide uprisings, would be actively pursuing the forces who had assaulted their various positions, consisting of a myriad of checkpoints, some combat outposts, even roving vehicle patrols. For the most part, like the Americans during the Tet offensive in Vietnam, they had beaten back these vicious attacks with their equally vigorous defenses, ultimately turning the tide with the massive aid of artillery, air, drone, and helo strikes, all flooding into the AO to assist the embattled KPA troops, as it had been largely subunits of their mechanized infantry brigade who had bore the brunt of the American attacks upon their different positions. This, as the People's Armed Police at the time, with the lion's share of its 2 light armored brigades in the AO having had been deployed to the far eastern boundary of it in support of other counterinsurgency operations being conducted against the Americans, which then had been happening in the Detroit AO at the time, the sole purpose of which being to capture or annihilate fleeing American partisans in an attempt to prevent their entry into the Ann Arbor region, and thereby preempt their ability to move in to assist other groups now springing up locally. KPA forces largely fought aggressively and prevailed in most places. However, smaller and more far-flung elements in remote garrisons, occupying outposts and roadside checkpoints, had been destroyed in several instances. Even a few roving vehicle patrols of KPA scouting elements had been wiped out by the Americans as well. Jacob woke up as Tony had shaken his shoulder, while also waking others who'd literally passed out on the floors while sleeping upright with their backs against the primitive dugout bunker's walls. Tony then informed Jacob and the others that he was effectively now in charge and that there'd be a dire need to plan a new mission, but also prepare to move camp, as no doubt the KPA would soon be trying to hunt them and other groups down as well, due to events from earlier. Although this was very true, as the KPA and PAP brigadier generals were making assault plans for the forested areas and farmlands throughout the AO's north, south, west, and even another citywide sweep to hunt for partisans. It would all take time, as forces and supplies for such a mission would first need to be consolidated, which would take perhaps a few days to maybe even a week of planning and assembly. In the meantime, smaller elements would carry out patrols, recon operations, and even more localized sweeps of their own within their subunits, specific sub-AO. Needless to say, Tony recruited Jacob and 8 others amid the non-injured survivors, as the wounded and injured in general needed to stay out of the fight, and of course, be given time to convalesce from their respective injuries having had earlier been sustained. Many men had perished, as the resources acquired from the invaders came at a very high cost, but would prove thus invaluable to the surviving men, who therefore would use these to ensure they'd make it through the first fall to winter time frame of the occupation. Otherwise, the men out in nature, lacking food, clean water, and supplies, may not have made it otherwise, including the now generous stock of arms, ammo, and light munitions, which now available to them, in addition to the sustenance items. This gave them now a very real chance at survival, or at least a head start. Jacob got ready, as did the others. The men feasted upon captured MREs and bottled waters, along with drinking coffee made over a barely burning fire that was so small it appeared as simple embers to keep it low-key from aerial view, as it would have a very tiny IR signature beneath the coniferous trees and pines of the forest canopy. Joseph drank 2 cups, then proceeded to walk to one of the heavily camouflaged all-terrain vehicles, which earlier had been unloaded hastily of all weapons and munitions, ammo, food, water, fuel, and even the packed up, very heavy KPVT machine gun, 14.5 millimeters of shredding anti-materiel destruction. Joseph locked and loaded his Chinese-made QBZ-95 rifle, originally given to him by Tony, likely having been acquired from a KIA'd PAP a paramilitary soldier earlier. He also ran into the hole, the entryway of the primitive bunker, grabbing himself a few grenades out of the box, as well as helping himself to 4 of the former KPA's grenades having been taken earlier as well. He also proceeded to sling an RPG on his back with one of the 3 rocket-sized packs typically worn on the backs of the designated soldiers operating such weaponry. "Whoa there! You Rambo or something? You even know how to use that?" Tony asked Jacob. "Yes, I've seen the others do it, by twisting it in to lock and arm it, and then you're all set." "Yeah, when you arm it, don't smack its nose into nothing too damn hard, or you out of there," retorted Tony. Jacob understood the perils associated with the arms he was utilizing, but he felt adventurous and still maintained a desire for revenge against the occupiers. He went from being totally feeling weak and inadequate as a man, unable to defend his family, to now undertaking a transformation into a warrior, something he never could have imagined for himself. It was something he never wanted nor asked for, but as a man, it's something he wished he had possessed when the damn war began. He hated himself. After all, for all intents and purposes, his family was gone, and he blamed himself relentlessly for this. He turned into a new man as a result. He lived now for revenge on those who wrecked and wreaked havoc upon his entire life. Jacob no longer even cared, really, if he survived or not, as he was taking more and more risks upon himself. No one made him. He could have left and gone his own way. Be that as it were, Tony became a sort of mentor to him, and Jacob was trainable and motivated by his own fury, and being an avidly quick learner also helped. He learned basic tactics from the war veterans among him from American prior wars, and memorized each and every one, and also learned the capabilities of his rifle inside out. Soon, he would learn about machine guns, but now he was trying out the RPG. One of the most effective types of weapons which his partisan outfit had managed to thus acquire up until this point, outside of perhaps the KPVT heavy machine gun. Jacob got into the seat of the all-terrain vehicle and cranked it up, shouldering the RPG behind his back, albeit with the rocket fully loaded in it, but facing upwards and over his back. He also put the hand grenades within a burlap sack, and his 4 freshly loaded rifle mags, including the one within the magazine weld of his rifle itself. He had 4 rockets, 2 anti-tank and 2 anti-personnel. The loaded one was an anti-tank rocket. The other 3 were within the pack he wore upon his back. Tony had earlier acquired a plate carrier with steel sappy plates. Though heavy, it afforded his vital organs incredible protection from small arms fire, vastly superior to ceramic sappy plates that typically shattered upon 4 to 6 rifle rounds impacting. He was ready for the enemy, despite this only being a scouting operation to find a new site to set up the camp, as, after all, staying on the move increased survival odds many times fold. With the wounded and supplies, it may take roughly 2 separate runs to move everyone and everything to a new site, as logistical planning and considerations figured into everything. Tony and the others, including Jacob, set out to the direct north and away from their current campsite. Also, getting further away from the zones they'd assaulted earlier, which lay both to the south of them and also southwest, they being the former checkpoints on the road directly south, and also the latter being the outpost where the KPVT heavy machine gun and the other items had been acquired. To the north, there lay uncertainty. It was close to the official AO boundaries, unbeknownst, of course, to the Americans, as this was an invisible demarcation line of different coalition forces elements. Only 7 miles lay between their current camp and the northern edges of the AO, as the men proceeded slowly and deliberately, attempting to conceal both their noise and also their heat signature, as it was now dark out. Evidently, it was later on the night of the 3rd day, going into day number 4. It officially was 9 p.m., as the 3rd day drew nearer to its close. Overall, due to no grid or comms on the American side, they were unaware that the final battles of the invasion phase of the whole conflict were drawing to a close. Invasion forces of the external component had, since the beginning of the 3rd day, the current day they were in, reached the middle of the USA at its deepest points, fanning out and assisting Trojans who were already far inland doing the proverbial heavy lifting of the invasion, thereby the externals acting as a potent reinforcement of sorts for these other elements, these Trojans. States like Colorado, Kansas, and Missouri were some of the geographically deepest parts of the now invaded land, whereby the last large battles were occurring at the end of the 3rd day, going into day number 4. Of course, Other isolated pockets existed elsewhere, but were being defeated if they hadn't already been so by the first and second days. One such remaining shrinking pocket was the home of the regime itself, its cap city, gradually being taken bit by bit, with little being left remaining by this point. Its defenders being largely the regime's remaining uniformed forces still intact, or tiny armed pro-regime civilian elements, were struggling against a tidal wave. One more official day of the invasion itself remained before the nation's regime will have officially capitulated, thus ending the war. Although then, formally under occupation as an entire land, America would see its uprisings of partisans beginning a long-haul insurgency, even after the entity known as the USA was thereby extinct and thus replaced by New China. One more day, which didn't matter here, because most of the land in general terms was already under occupation by the end of day number 2, including locally, where Jacob and the others now scratched out a living. Soon, the group found a road, a simple farm road, with the 2 yellow painted dividing lines running through it. They paused at the road and tried to deem whether or not it was safe to even cross. Some minutes went by and passed with no activity. "We ride parallel. Don't cross. Don't leave the safety of the tree line," barked Tony to the others in a low, gruff voice in an attempt to prevent it from carrying long distance. They all turned their ATVs and did as ordered, continuing to the east now, very slowly and deliberately to maintain noise discipline to the best of their abilities. Safety was what mattered at night, as Ch1com recon assets stayed busy during the night and day, but they owned the night, looking for any and all irregularities. They'd already conducted several drone strikes on other small American groups earlier, fairly nearby. Although this wasn't known to Tony or the others. However, the hunt was on. Now that the local coalition occupation troops had earlier taken some damage from resurgent Americans rising back up from the depths of annihilation, something totally unexpected by the occupation troops, as it had been assumed they'd wiped out all remaining resistance in the area at the time this occurred. Soon, the intelligence gathered by locally posted MSS agents, or Ministry of State Security agents of the Ch1coms, liaisoning with both their own fellow PAP elements and also their KPA allies in the area, providing them with very detailed reports on American activities and rat lines, which thereby would allow for the intel gathered from new prisoners to thereby be utilized to intercept, interdict, and kill or capture more Americans. Something June, Jacob's now captured and enslaved wife, had inadvertently assisted with, as she knew nothing about how interrogations even worked. Jacob was on red alert in the sense of the pun and the reality. He watched all around him, out across the road and forward, as he drove with the others in a staggered formation of the ATV vehicles. He took the side along the road as they drove parallel to it currently. Finally, after driving perhaps several miles, they came to a northern suburban spur, similar to their first, where they encountered the KPA reconnaissance troops, but this was even bigger. "Shit!" ripped Tony, sounding angry at this development. It was dark, aside from the limited crescent moon out and the stars in the night sky. The buildings, once more, had an eerie silence in their darkness. Some were visibly destroyed. Former retail buildings and fast food places. Piles of rubble left over from perhaps artillery or mortars or the like. In fact, the area had been viciously cleared earlier on day one of the invasion by PAP light tank companies from one of their two different light armored brigades, total of 16 battalions that they held between them. Each battalion, of course, was comprised of 8 different companies. Type 62Gs held devastating firepower for a light tank, most armed with the Chinese Type 83 105mm guns, although some still with the original 85mm guns, still plenty destructive in terms of the shells they fired. The latter was more for simple economical reasons, simply to help dispose of the many, many millions of 85mm tank shells having been accrued over the years. These PAP units had committed many atrocities in the area, and as the men carefully continued forward at a continuous shuffle, and a cautious one at that, they began to see corpses along the roadside as they creeped nearer to the cluster of dark buildings and rubble in the near distance. Some of these corpses had been tied to trees, having been used as bayonet practice by bloodthirsty PAP CCP fanatics. Some others had been burned up, likely by flamethrowers, along the road. Abandoned, burned up, and shot up vehicles littered the roadside as they inched closer and closer. It appeared that people had originally tried to flee the area, only then to be intercepted and destroyed as they fled by vehicle and on foot. The bodies stank, as it now had been a few days since they'd been KIA'd, mostly innocent civilians. Very few had weapons, personal weapons, that they attempted to resist with in a mindless, haphazard, reckless, reactionary sort of way, meaning non-tactically, only to be mowed down in the process. Jacob stopped, spotting an AR laying off in the dirt by the road, dropped by one of the deceased civilians. Tony looked back at everyone, and seeing Jacob looking at it, snapped, "Don't do it! Don't even think about it!" He snapped as if warning he was about to kick Jacob's ass or something, to which Jacob looked back in a bit of an angry scowl. "Don't get an attitude with me. I'm trying to keep us alive. Damn enemy been through here. We don't want nothing to see us from the air. Don't you forget that either," he said in an angry tone, matter-of-factly. It was nothing personal. It's just that Tony had already been a veteran of a foreign war, now seeing destruction and enough death for 2 lifetimes. Said it more out of concern and care, not out of malice whatsoever at all. Even if it was stern, Jacob obeyed, backing up from about to step off of his ATV, and continued slowly forward instead beneath the trees and undergrowth with everyone else. By now, they were reaching the clearing, where the forest officially came to its end, actually dropping off immediately by a hotel, which was now full of holes and collapsing walls and roof. It was a shell of what it once had been, and now was a husk of a building. Bodies lay everywhere, still, amid the parking lot. This lot itself was filled with craters, and flipped and shredded even some burned-up hulks that had once been civilian vehicles, cars, vans, trucks, and more. It was a hotel. The sign was gone, but it likely was something similar to perhaps a Holiday Inn or something like this at one time. It was dark and silent. "Cut engines. Do it now," snapped Tony. On command, they all cut their ATVs. Tony was quiet, as were the others. Now, it was time to look and listen carefully. They sat there, perhaps 30 minutes, in so doing, keenly observing everything they could. And what few had their own night vision or infrared goggles paid very special attention. They even looked into the sky, out from beneath the tree line, where they were able to do so, scanning for any potential visible lights flashing, indicating some kind of aircraft, helos, or perhaps drones. Nothing in the immediate vicinity for now, but that could change at any time. And of course, didn't mean that higher altitude assets weren't there and watching. For now, though, if cautious, they might get away with what they were about to do next. Figure out if this area or others in the nearby vicinity were safe enough to find a way across, since these developed areas were very difficult to find cover, unlike the wilderness areas nearby, thereby to make their way through to find a new base camp to dig into for the partisan group. The hotel had been thrashed by tank shells. Perhaps a few anti-tank missiles had hit it, or also simple rockets of the RPG varieties as well. It was a reinforced concrete building pockmarked by rounds of all sizes, as well as gutted by munitions. The inside was totally visible to where the ripped apart furniture could be seen in some of its rooms. The plumbing was torn up also, but because the grid had been hacked and shut off, there of course was no flooding present. However, the building, even in its current state, represented either a hazard or maybe even a blessing, all depending upon whether they could use it to hide, cross through, or, on the flip side, if the enemies were present inside or near the structure, somewhere in hiding, laying an ambush. Tony had briefed the men on such potential enemy activities, as some of the men were never before in the service and knew nothing of how professional forces operated and just conducted themselves in different situations in general anyway. Jacob already thought about these things upon seeing all the corpses along the way in, realizing there'd been a massive slaughter in the area fairly recently. The men now cautiously formed up into a rolling diamond formation to watch all sides as they moved tactically as a small group across the lot. They went in through a massive hole on its western-facing wall and walked right through one of the former hotel rooms and into the hall, with the men stacking onto the wall before high-lowing both sides of the door, before ensuring the hall was clear to safely enter. The hall was now flanked on each side by a 5-man stack team. On one side, and Tony on the other side with the other team. Concrete was sagging off of bent girders, protruding down from above in some places, where blasts had ripped up the interior of the structure upon either tank shells or anti-tank missiles hitting it. It was incredible that the Americans now had cohesion together, working as a bona fide tactical team, like a true infantry squad. They'd survived the earlier Tet-style offensive against the KPA, and the run-in also with the scouting platoon even before that. They now had some combat experience, and they'd need to use it soon, as the new war of the counterinsurgency levied against them, a whole new phase, would be heating up immensely. There was noise, but it was still just the sounds of a lone artillery shell blasting in the distance somewhere. But otherwise, it was still somewhat quiet in this area. But then the men reached the stairs of the hall. Tony chose to head up to try to get a better look. Quietly, the men proceeded up the staircase tactically as a single 10-man team, along with Tony leading them as the point man. He got to the top, and the others took up positions to watch the rest of the hall and entry of the staircase on the second floor, as a huge chunk of building had been simply blasted out and into a rubble pile, with hanging wall above from bent girders and beams. The hole was large. So Tony laid down and got binoculars out and used his night vision goggles and binoculars together to the best of his ability. He checked the area as the others behind him, watching the hallway towards his back and rooms and staircase that they had also just climbed. "We got movement. Back up. Back up and hit the prone. Take a zone of fire. Guard your zone, guard it well. Some kind of patrol or something," Tony whispered loudly as he crawled backwards slightly and aimed his QBB-95 light machine gun he brought from the camp to use as his primary weapon. Only far enough to not be as obvious, but to where he could unload down onto the road and side streets that ran through the area, if needed. There, of course, were a hodgepodge of former retail buildings in the immediate vicinity, with a few motels and even the current 3-floor former hotel in which they now currently found themselves. Many buildings had been smashed into rubble piles and total wreckage, with destroyed, burned up, shot up, or crushed vehicles strewn about the entire area. Those crushed, of course, had been earlier run over by Ch1com PAP light tanks. There indeed was movement and motors sounding now in the near distance, though growing nearer as the rumble and squeaking of armored vehicles could now be heard. It seemed to be a KPA patrol of mechanized infantry. They came in their BMP-1 infantry fighting vehicles and VTT-323 armor personnel carriers. They came as an entire company element, minus, of course, the headquarters platoon, as this must have come from a nearby outpost or other such position, while leaving its headquarters platoon behind to tend to the facility as they went out on their patrol. The nerves of the men were rattled, not having had expected such a force to be passing through, as by now, until this point, all had been eerily quiet, apart from distant blasts from other areas. Tony, not sure what to do, chose to wait. He realistically understood his men had no real chance in this instance, as the mechanized infantry forces were moving and on high alert now that it was understood that partisan activities had arisen in earnest within the Ann Arbor AO. This meant that there was no possibility of sustaining any sort of surprise, as the enemies were looking for potential trouble upon which to wreak havoc upon with their powerful weaponry. Tony told his men to stay quiet and stay still. As the element rolled on the street off to the distance of the hotel, where it itself had a driveway leading into the parking lot, the Korean People's Army group kept on rolling, with armor personnel carrier gunners scanning their sectors, along with the potent turrets of the BMP-1 infantry fighting vehicles in the convoy doing the same. Floodlights were on, as were spotlights upon the turrets of the vehicles, largely due to a lack of night vision equipment in the Korean People's Army. They brightly shined, causing Tony to remove his night vision goggles, as the strong lighting would be blinding would he be required to respond by laying down fire, as the NVGs would then be worthless in the face of such lighting. Others already knew the deal and did likewise as Tony with their NVGs, if they even had any, as the convoy of some 15 vehicles moved methodically and slowly down the street. They came to the intersection, whereby they now came to a halt. Gunners on the APCs, as well as the BMP turrets, ever scanning for enemies should trouble erupt suddenly in their midst. Tony's stomach was in knots, remembering all the recent losses among his men. Good men, who shown they had heart, but fell to the foreign fire. He didn't want the same to happen to he and his tiny 10-man group he led. He lacked the men or quantity of firepower to take on KPA forces present, as only 2 men of his had rocket-propelled grenades, and the rest of the weapons would do nothing but maybe scratch the paint on the armor of the Korean People's Army vehicles, being that rifles and light machine guns weren't up to the task now before them, as this was 3 combat platoons out of a KPA mechanized infantry company. Soon, however, the convoy started up again, making a right-hand turn at the intersection, proceeding down a perpendicular street to the one upon which lay the hotel position of Tony and his force. as they turned. It was going down at the hands of some other American partisan element who lit up the convoy. As it was halfway through its turn at the intersection with all of its vehicles, truly the best time to hit it, as it was curled as a line of vehicles, making the focus of all its firepower to the left very difficult without creating the very real prospect of some friendly fire should vehicles still on the previous street try to fire to the front left side. Rocket-propelled grenades had flown towards the front two vehicles, which were VTT-323 armor personnel carriers, weaker in armored protection than the BMP-1 infantry fighting vehicles, which managed to successfully hit the vehicles, blasting their front engine covers off the vehicles, while smoke shot up and out of the drivers' and gunners' hatches due to the angles of the hits, along with limbs of those manning the aforementioned positions. Needless to say, the men in the troop cabs of these vehicles were either badly maimed or injured or KIA'd. As these vehicles were hit, the others immediately behind it fought an intense battle whereby they fired on both sides of the streets the best they could at targets to their right and left of the remaining vehicles in the convoy. The vehicles, having not completed fully the turn, added to the fire to the enemies on the right, before then pulling out of the formation to roll through the parking lot of a rubbled and smashed former fast food place, with the intent to fight their way to the front to guard the two disabled vehicles in order that medics could search for wounded survivors in the troop cabs, laying down cover fire as they did so. Thus far, no troops dismounted their vehicles to engage the Americans, largely due to the commands from the Tactical Operations Center, manned by their headquarters platoon, back at their outpost that they had come from, ordering them to take precautions as it was now nighttime and enemies could be anywhere. The vehicles' combined firepower was destructive enough, as they sprayed 12.7 millimeter and 14.5 millimeter tracers from their armor personnel carriers, as BMPs, or BMP-1s, fired their 73 millimeter cannons and 7.62 by 54 millimeter coax machine guns. Blasts had already eliminated many American combatants from these infantry fighting vehicle main cannons, with the heavy machine guns on the armor personnel carriers lighting up the area also, figuratively and very literally, with all the tracer ammunition being fired. Tony, unsure what to do, didn't want to draw any fire upon his men, as again, he didn't have the numbers and was terribly outgunned by the enemy. It truly was a tough call to make. "To hell with this, we gotta help him," yelled Tony, as he watched the proverbial fireworks display of the KPA firepower being laid down upon the area. He opened fire with his light machine gun, aiming now for the armor personnel carrier gunners, while Jacob sprung into action, aiming his rocket-propelled grenade at one of the 3 BMP-1s. He fired his first RPG, which, needless to say, missed a bit to the right as he anticipated recoil that never came. as this was a tube-fired rocket with no significant recoil whatsoever at all. The rocket crashed near the track of a BMP-1, causing the gunner of the rear armor personnel carrier at the back of the convoy to shift his orientation back to his sector, watching the very rear of the convoy, having just briefly aided the other vehicles to fight the Americans on the right flank of their convoy. Jacob acted fast and reloaded another rocket from his 3-rocket pack that he wore on his back. He loaded the other anti-tank rocket and fired again at the BMP-1, hitting the turret this time, blasting through it and blowing out pieces of metal in a cloud of smoke and debris, thereby crippling its 73mm cannon and coax machine gun in the process as the rocket went through the back of this turret. Smoke billowed out of the top of the turret of the BMP-1 he actually managed to hit. It was a well-placed shot, able to be well aimed upon immediately getting the hang of the weapon once he's seen how it handled after his first shot. The armor personnel carrier gunner was blasting chunks out of the concrete remaining on the hotel's walls and floors as rounds cracked upon spraying up debris wherever they managed to land their blows. The tracers had guided the gunner to quickly readjust his fire in the dark, as well as shining the turret spotlight on the hotel itself. "Hit these sons of bitches, then we go!" Tony yelled over the cacophony of cracking and whapping noises of rounds slapping all over the building. These were large 12.7mm rounds, which were heavy machine gun rounds doing what they did best, tearing through barrier targets. The walls couldn't hold the spray of these potent bullets forever, as they were tearing through the concrete and causing a storm of debris within the shredded up remains of the hotel. "Get down! Only fire when you got a shot!" yelled Tony, partially regretting having gotten them involved and thus blowing their originally intended mission. Despite this being the case, he felt it necessary to help fellow Americans in serious trouble. Though hardly able to see them, it was well understood they were being cut down quickly and easily by the KPA. Even though initially they'd actually managed to get 2 of the KPA's vehicles. Unaware of the ambush, although hastily ripping apart the ambushing forces of the Americans, Tony rolled to and fro, narrowly avoiding flying concrete pieces and fragments coming from the walls above him, ripping through by these highly devastating 12.7mm rounds. He let his light machine gun rip here and there, but now fired in short, hasty bursts before rolling more, side to side, back and forth, through the hall. Everyone stayed down and rolled into and out of rooms, through the hall, just trying to avoid all the debris shooting from the walls, some of it potentially harmful, especially to the eyes. One man stood up to fire his rifle at the last vehicle's armor personnel carrier turret gunner, only to be shredded then to literal pieces as rounds flew into the wall below the hole he fired his rifle through in the room across from the stairs to the left side of the hallway. He was ripped into hunks of bone and flesh and shredded organs that splattered the room behind him as he was torn apart, literally. His remaining torso fell backwards in a disgustingly gory display. "Go! GTFO! Now!" yelled Tony as Jacob popped up and fired one of the remaining 2 rockets he had left, both being anti-personnel rockets, as he had already used up his 2 anti-tank rockets. It flew and hit the back of an armored personnel carrier at the end of the convoy, but didn't penetrate as it was slightly underpowered as an anti-personnel round. The other man with the other RPG fired a round as well, his being an anti-tank rocket, which hit the back top near the turret as a perhaps 30-degree angle strike, passing through the lightly armored roof of the vehicle, maiming many and killing in action 2 inside. Smoke shot up and out of the gunner's hatch, with dark-looking debris, liquid-like, possibly blood and body parts, which was most likely the case, as it was dark out and difficult to see the details. The men, still heavily outnumbered and undergunned, fled down the stairs, as other rounds from another vehicle taking the now disabled rear vehicle's place on convoy rear security struck the building in the last vehicle's place. The men bolted quickly across the back parking lot behind the building, running crouched to keep a low silhouette as to hopefully not be spotted. The remaining vehicles had finally dismounted their troops, who began to clear both of the convoy's flanks before then turning with their remaining vehicles to conduct a rolling shield maneuver against the hotel. By then, though, the men had gotten back upon their camouflaged all-terrain vehicles, which they'd left at the edge of the wood line before taking off in a hurry. They'd lost 1 man, so only 9 were left. And tracers now began to fly through the woods just behind them. They bolted, and fortunately, the ground was varied terrain, hills and ravines, and higher and lower ground overall along the route. This eventually made the situation a bit safer, as rounds smacked harmlessly into mounds and higher hilly terrain in the forest behind them as they moved with a purpose and out of the area in great haste. There was a total now of 3 destroyed armored personnel carriers and 1 BMP-1 of the 3 of them present suffering severe turret damage, having lost its now limp 73mm cannon and coax machine gun. The rest of the vehicles now acted as a mobile fire support platform for all their troops, as the remaining 2 BMP-1s and 9 armored personnel carriers of the group now pursued the Americans who fled from the hotel. No artillery support had been called in as of yet, as there had been seen no need for it due to the danger close aspect of the combat near the intersection, as well as the Americans in the hotel having been perceived to be a small group, which indeed they were. The vehicle's floodlighting and spotlights could be seen looming through the trees behind them, split into many beams due to all of the trees distorting such within the darkened forest terrain. There was rumbling now, coming from the direction from which they'd originally came in. whilst earlier running parallel to the road toward the suburban outer spur they'd just egressed from. This was becoming a horrible situation for Tony and Jacob and the remaining men present, as one among them had been brutally ripped to literal pieces by the devastating 12.7 millimeter rounds. "Turn left! Cross the road to the north! Do it! Do it now!" screamed Tony, barking the order with a dire sense of deep-seated concern. This, as he took a split second to think of what might happen if he couldn't find a way out of the situation. Little did Tony know, but there was another 2 mechanized infantry companies inbound from the local KPA battalion responsible for this sector of the Ann Arbor AO. One of them was now in front of them, and the other one, who'd sustained the damages behind them, was still lingering around the hotel. With the other company inbound from the north-south road, whereby the intersection ambush had just occurred behind their current position. Tony and the others, lacking other choices, as lights shone from ahead of them, which would have constituted pure disaster upon the all-terrain vehicles if spotted from the myriad of lighting, as they were fully alert and now looking for threats. Obviously, the other company called in their situation report and reported contact with the Americans, thus leading them to requesting reinforcements, medevac, and recovery assets for the damaged vehicles. Immediately, there was massive gunfire from ahead. Tony and 3 others who had fled across the road first, instead of fleeing south into all the massive foliage that would have slowed the progress of transit considerably, potentially thereby leading to their demise due to being easily seen and thereby lit up as a result. Of the 4 total crossing, including Tony, in this act of desperation, one of the all-terrain vehicles was barely clipped with some rounds as it quickly crossed the road. But the driver otherwise had made it unharmed. Moreover, however, one was peppered with 7.62 by 54 millimeter machine gun rounds from the coax machine gun on the leading BMP-1, shredding the man and his all-terrain vehicle to bits of plastic, metal, and human flesh and blood. All as the rounds tore through, leaving the bloody corpse leaning slumped onto its steering wheel. This, along with fluids now leaking out of the massive holes left in the frame of metal of what remained of the all-terrain vehicle, full of gaping holes, all leaking oil and other fluids, mixing now with the man's blood as it skidded slightly to the edge of the other side of the road, doing so on its own momentum from the attempt to cross the road. Tony and the 2 others had thus made it, but it was then that the situation fell apart completely. The 5 others, including Jacob, were now stuck as the KPA vehicles knew they were and were now lighting up trees with machine gun fire as well as 73 millimeter shells, blasting pieces of trees into deadly splintering shrapnel along with the regular shrapnel. It therefore had become a highly risky situation and far too dangerous to attempt to drive across with all-terrain vehicles for Jacob and the second group. now that it had been already attempted by the first group. If they dared try, they'd all be shot to pieces, as the element of surprise when trying to cross had now been completely lost. "Get down!" yelled Jacob. He was in a bad spot. They'd run out of rocket-propelled grenade ammo, and all they had now were some hand grenades and, of course, their regular rifles, and one had a Type 81 light machine gun. The men, now on their stomachs in the prone position, had to find a way out of the situation in which they now found themselves, being separated from the first group, having already crossed. Their all-terrain vehicles were totally destroyed by this point anyhow, shot to total shit, with two of them blown into literal pieces, including some plastic and metal parts now hanging from tree limbs on some of the larger trees. It was a disaster. "We gotta run! We ain't got no other damn choice! It's our only chance! If we move fast enough," screamed Jacob in pure desperation, while taking initiative for what seemed like the first time in his life. This was Jacob's time, his chance to prove himself as a leader. Indeed, he did lead. The men then followed him near the edge, crawling up and down the topography of the various mounds and crawling amid the trees and rocks, finally coming to the wood line by the road. With he leading the way by waving his left arm while clenching his QBZ-95 seemingly tighter than he had ever squeezed anything in his entire life. Sweat was soaking his head as his reflexes took over, and things seemed to move very slowly, although in actual reality things moved extremely rapidly, but in his mind, he couldn't process the speed of his own body movements, making him feel, at least, as if he were watching himself move, nearly in the third-person concept. He bolted faster than he had ever ran in his entire life, which felt like a blur to him at this point. Jacob was leading the others, who now desperately ran beside and behind him as the men crossed in front of the KPA convoy, now roughly 80 meters away from them, coming from the direction they'd originally come from towards the hotel. Itself headed to the company that had previously been engaged at the intersection. None of the men even dared try to fire upon the armored vehicles, as they'd have had no chances with their current arms anyhow, and had to focus entirely on just being able to merely make it across the road safely. All efforts had to be focused upon bolting across this road. Just then, as they made their bold, urgent dash to survive, 3 of the men had been cut down, with one of them taking a 7.62 by 54 millimeter round through his forearm while running. Though fast-moving targets were indeed difficult to hit, machine guns and rapid firearms in general enhanced such probabilities substantially. "Oh, my arm! Shit!" yelled the man in agony, who suffered a clean wound through the forearm. Jacob and the other men looked him over as they crawled low on the ground as fire zipped overhead and hit the trees or splashed around them into mounds of earth. "You'll be all right. It's a clean wound. Looks like it clipped some bone, though, too. Come on. We gotta get beyond this mound. Roll up and over. Hurry!" Jacob yelled with authority. still on a sort of virtual autopilot of sorts, totally lost within the moment. His adrenaline had caused his muscle memory to thereby take over from what training and experience he had managed to acquire up until that point, with Jacob not even realizing completely that he was in the zone, so to speak. All three of them rolled up and down the other side as rounds splashed throughout both sides of the woods, which lay on either side of the road, including the occasional very potent 73 millimeter shell coming from the BMP 1s in the convoy. Fortunately, the convoy didn't actually stop and kept on moving. It was under orders to proceed to their primary objective, to only return fire if Americans were actually seen and positively identified, or if they were fired upon. It, of course, went without saying, however, that the convoy radioed in the coordinates of the Americans and their current assumed positions for a follow-up artillery strike, which would take minutes to be relayed to the FDC of the KPA allied PLA artillery batteries in the nearest outposts, themselves providing the local artillery support to the local Ch1com PAP, as well as KPA allied units in the Ann Arbor AO. As the stream of vehicles passed, the men caught their breath but stayed low. The wounded man, as the two others had been KIA'd, was tended to by the man who at least had some basic gauze and bandages with triple antibiotic ointment, which was nearly all used up on the man's disgustingly gaping arm wound to prevent gangrene or any other sorts of infections. "Hey!" came a yell. It was Tony, who called the three remaining men, including Jacob, over to him and the others with him that had crossed the first time on their ATVs. Now it was only Tony, Jacob, and three other men left out of the original 10, and Tony as leader. "We are combat ineffective, but we're going to complete the damn mission. We ain't losing good folks for nothing. We got to finish this shit," said Tony angrily, thinking of all the death he'd already seen and experienced as a whole, and losing virtually virtually over half of the squad that he'd brought along. Tony was honorable, a do-gooder, willing to help other Americans and American partisan forces in need. He lost men doing so, but he felt it was a just cause. "How's everyone on ammo?" Tony snapped, thinking of what all had just happened. Everyone responded yellow when it came to rifle or LMG ammo, red on RPG ammo, and green on hand grenades, as none had actually been used. Tony, though having made it with two others crossing on their ATVs, only two made it before the machine guns ripped the last man who failed in his crossing. He had ammo on the backs of the two remaining ATVs and told the men to grab all they could carry, and wasn't sure what all was packed because he ordered others to put certain ammo boxes on the backs of them. Jacob now ran as the coast had been clear for several minutes upon the shooting having had ceased. He found a small wooden box with both 5.8 by 42 millimeter Ch1com ammo for his rifle and belted of the same on bandoliers for the QBB 95 light machine gun, which equipped Tony. There were more grenades and also some 7.62 by 39 millimeter for the Type 58 North Korean rifles, and also for the man armed with a Ch1com Type 81 light machine gun. The men grabbed all the ammo they could in a hurry, leaving virtually nothing left, save perhaps what fell onto the ground in the dark as the men cleaned out the assortment. Now replenished, the remaining men now proceeded upon foot hurriedly out of the immediate area, knowing full well it was too dangerous to linger much longer. After all, they had now been there for several minutes. Moving out swiftly after taking a few short minutes replenishing their arms, they headed back towards whence they'd just come from, just in time to dodge several 152 millimeter artillery shells having flown in to decimate their positions on either side of the road, the position they'd crossed from as well as where they had just left from. Tony had decided the mission had to be completed because he felt very avidly that no men should be lost for nothing. He therefore reasoned that they must fulfill their aims because the others back at the camp, hiding in the bunkers, depended on this mission being successful. And a new site had to be chosen to move to, lest they sit at their last camp far too long, only then to be wiped out by artillery, drone, air, helo, or missile strikes perhaps, or worse, be cleaned out by ruthless ground troops of the occupation forces. Atrocities were well understood by this point. It was well known that field atrocities, summary executions, even involving torture, were the norm against the Americans. It was China's own war of extermination, prosecuted by the Himmler of the East himself, Wei Fang, who himself vowed to make slaves of or erase entirely the American people from the face of the earth. As to him, they only existed to serve China. Otherwise, they were unworthy of life. Though not as viciously genocidal as the Ch1coms, the Russians and other allies were plenty brutal in their own right, though their methodology against the Americans varied. Some turned them over directly to China, some carried out their own programs, and some even turned to assimilation, such as in Alaska, as Russia needed some population growth and forced Americans and Canadians as well in the Arctic Circle into becoming Russian citizens, thereby learning the Russian language and culture. All in all, with such means in play, America legally not only ceased to exist as a nation, its people were dispossessed, stateless people, by the coalition's so-called legalistic titles. China called them this to make their extermination and slavery of them more palatable to the masses back home. With the right propaganda delivery, it worked. We move, most likely, when they're finished here soon. Meanwhile, everyone shut up. Don't say a damn thing. Watch for my hand signals. We will move as soon as I see an opportunity, or whenever they've departed, whichever happens first, Tony commanded, as he thought out the situation, including possible tactical considerations and backup ad hoc plans, should something else go horribly wrong. Everyone gave a single nod, saying nothing. Each man formed into the diamond formation in the prone position, each man having taken a position on the clock, as it were, in the diamond. They scanned and observed, with all the lighting made manifest from the KPA vehicles, the movements of their enemy, all as they loaded their wounded, checked the battlefield, and heaped piles of dead American partisans from near the intersection from earlier. It was literally dozens of deceased Americans. There were some still alive who the KPA had thereby lined up. They were beating a few with the butts of their rifles, checking them in their solar plexus and stomach. One even got punched in the face by a KPA soldier who reared back from behind his shoulder and came crashing down onto the man's cheek, knocking him to the ground with a knockout blow. No doubt causing a major shiner on his eye as a result. Tony was angry, livid, watching these few dozen American POWs having been captured by the original company that they'd attacked moments ago, before reinforcements showed up. KPA troops now keeping them lined up. Some were injured from the earlier fighting with blood-soaked clothing. It didn't matter because the KPA troops were livid. They were furious. Furious at the loss of 3 of their vehicles to them, as well as one of them being badly damaged, the BMP-1. They lost men in those armor personnel carriers as well as those who were injured. They finished with their random blows on the American partisans before loading up about 12 of them into a supply truck, likely from the headquarters platoon, belonging to one of the 3 companies now there, pulling security and clearing the battlefield, doing a battle damage assessment as well. There were 14 Americans who still had to be loaded up, and there was another truck. But before they began the process, there was a KPA company captain over one of the 3 different now-present companies on the scene, as its ranking officer, who himself began to walk down the line of prisoners of war, as if inspecting them, as they were all zip-tied by this point, of course. He then, upon examining them, walked behind the line, shooting 4 of them, randomly choosing 4 to execute, with 1 pistol round to the brainstem of each, from his Type 66 in classic execution-style fashion. His pistol essentially being a Makarov 9mm copy, the Type 66. The men basically dropped like sacks of potatoes upon being shot. The others were now struck by fear. Fear of knowing what their experience in Chinese custody was about to be like if the North Koreans of the KPA were this brutal. Tony's blood pressure skyrocketed. witnessing the ugly reality of how these vile oppressors operated. This used to be their country as Americans. Now, it really hit people the night of the third day of the invasion as a whole. It wasn't theirs anymore. And if they wanted it back, it would involve the loss of enormous, unimaginable, multiple millions of lives. Indeed, it would, and wouldn't even realize its full resolution complete until much further down the road. In other words, this was New China now, and they weren't going anywhere. Some time went by, and the 3 destroyed and 1 damaged vehicle were towed away by the Korean People's Army recovery vehicles, as were their dead and wounded retrieved by trucks acting as field ambulances from the headquarters platoons of the 3 companies. Of course, the prisoners also headed to their new hell, beginning their new lives in the Ch1com Laogai system, as the KPA would thereby be turning them over to the Chinese PAP. Now, as the KPA departed, Tony and the others got up. As he waved his arm to move out, fires now burned as rubble lay strewn about from the destruction of the prior battles at the beginning with the People's Armed Police, but also now from the most recent fighting with the KPA. Running past the pile of American dead, the men's stomachs turned, as many of the eyes were still open on the faces of the deceased, contorted into faces of total horror. Some were missing body parts and limbs, while yet some were completely, even unrecognizable. Tony led the men past the intersection where the ambush had initially occurred earlier. As they ran in a rolling diamond formation, watching all sides for any lingering threats, were any to even still exist. They ran past some more rubbled former fast food style buildings and the wreckage of the strip mall, and a neighborhood sat right beyond, a suburban neighborhood with its cul-de-sacs and moderately sized 2,500 square foot homes. They were on high alert as they proceeded through the dark, turning behind the battered strip mall, with its big box stores badly battle damaged, with the collapsed portions of the walls from small shells or missiles. Some more dilapidated, with their roofs also caved in as well from the blasting from earlier combat. There came a voice suddenly as they rounded the corner. "Friendly!" yelled a man who emerged from behind the ripped-up wooden fencing behind the row of stores in the strip mall's rear area. Everyone was already on alert and nearly shot him as he yelled this, especially Tony, who was feeling anxious and ready on the trigger. Jacob watched his sector on the left side of the diamond formation, staring out through the torn-up wooden fencing, whereby he crouched low, scanning the backyard and suburban home. He could slightly see where 4 of the wooden panels of the fence were torn up. It was all silent and dark again. The eerie silence of the area had once again now returned, as the KPA had left. While Jacob pulled security of his sector, Tony spoke with the man. who himself had explained to Tony that he possibly was the only survivor of the ambush group who'd virtually all been KIA'd or captured just then by the PAP, or I'm sorry, the KPA, explaining who he was previously affiliated with. He mentioned that his group had stayed in the area but avoided the neighborhood right behind him now, as there were mines and traps in the area, as well as sniper activity as early as roughly 24 hours ago in that very neighborhood. Hearing this, Jacob kept his crouched composure and also edged over now slightly to his left to get behind some of the remaining wood panels of the fencing to better conceal himself. Tony thanked him, told him his objectives for his group, and took him on as a member of his element now that the man had lost just now his old group. 84 men had been slaughtered and 26 captured all in all from this man's group. He was all that remained who was uncaptured or unkilled. Tony then proceeded to inform the man that he and his men, he had aided them, but nearly met their own demise as they attempted to egress the area from the hotel in which they had tried to provide oversight from. Finally, it was explained to Anders, the man who'd just been encountered, that Tony and his men were seeking a far more safe location as a base camp than the forested location they were in currently. Anders told Tony that there were drainage tunnels which connected the two sewers closer in towards Ann Arbor proper, sewers that could sustain groups of people in hiding. Tony was then led to the nearest drainage corridor, and the grate was lifted to it. Wherefore he proceeded then to drop down in before climbing back out. "This'll do it for now. Look, we only got 2 ATVs back there in the woods that weren't totally shot to shit. They're probably gone now. So we'll have to complete this mission on foot. We will have to make it back, and we will have to use what ATVs we have that are still at the campsite to bring everything out to these underground grates. Of the remaining ATVs, it should suffice to carry everyone here, where we can camouflage them by the wood line, like where we originally came in. And people can make runs back and forth carrying supplies. We will stay in the sewers and tunnels until things calm down, while also planning our next operations." Nobody disagreed, although the numbers of the men had been badly thinned out in a matter of a few days, even with George, the former leader, terribly wounded back at the current site of the group. Arrangements would be made to bring him and the other wounded to safety as well. All the wounded would be able to thereby rest and recover, while the able-bodied carried out more missions, despite the dire consequences oftentimes of doing so. There weren't many of them left, anyhow, as it stood. During the conflict thus far, the attrition rate was dangerously lopsided, and many more Americans had fallen than had enemy invasion forces, to be sure. However, as Americans would acquire better weapons as time went on, and more became experienced and combat tested, things would change for the better from the American perspective, at least a little bit. But for now, the coalition owned the battlefield, and decisively so. It was now edging towards the middle of the night on day number 3, moving towards day number 4. "Move, move, move! Line up!" yelled Alice, the block captain, as she was rounding up the other camp inmates of block number 15. She continued yelling this urgently, as the sky had been dark now for a little bit, as evening had turned so into now early night. It was time for the evening roll call. She was urgently hustling and bustling and moving with a purpose, as did the other inmates who knew the drill by now, as they ran out of the barracks and into the yard facing the entryway gate of the block. She ran by, counting all of them before standing in front of the group, now arrayed in a square formation consisting of all the block's female prisoners. June was among them, her first night out of the intake cell house and into the regular transit area's general population. The chain link gate opened, and PAP guards entered in their dark gear and black grayish camo uniforms. They held cattle prods, and of course had other non-lethals on their mala gear and belts. One of them was a Chief Sergeant 4th Class, a company-level NCO within the People's Armed Police. He had with him a staff sergeant, sergeant, corporal, and 5 privates 1st class. Of the troops, the 5 guards, the privates, stood facing the group between the formation of prisoners and the non-commissioned officers who also entered along with the privates, all with cattle prods in hand. Oddly enough, the Chief Sergeant 4th Class was visiting different blocks, and himself was typically wasn't typically a normal fixture at the inmate roll calls. Normally, the staff sergeant below him, essentially a platoon sergeant of the PAP, was in charge of all the roll calls per block, and the ranks beneath the staff sergeants, such as the sergeants or corporals, actually held the roll calls. Alice, the block captain, ran up to the corporal stating that 85 prisoners were accounted for the block. Then she turned and ran back in front of the formation of the prisoners. Upon completing the report, the corporal turned to face the sergeant, who in turn informed the staff sergeant. "Give me 5 now!" screamed the sergeant just then. The corporal told the 5 troops he was in command of to grab 5 different inmates and bring them forward. Immediately, the 5 inmates were violently yanked out of the group and stood in front of the whole formation facing them, with the People's Armed Police guards behind each one that they'd struck instant terror into. "It has come to my attention that someone here failed to complete their duties. The captain's office was not sufficiently cleaned. There were stains upon the meeting table, and floors not swept and mopped correctly. You know for this, there will be punishment. We will teach you lazy bitches some discipline, shrieked the sergeant maniacally, with vigorous brutality in his tone, as he took his cattle prod and beat the women, walking down the line, hitting them in their solar plexus, knocking the wind out of them before shocking them over and over as they lay upon the ground, one at a time, after striking their bodies with the blunt object in an unimaginable fury, erupting now from the calm he had originally exhibited upon entering the block's yard. Painful yelps and screams were heard, as for about 10 minutes he shocked them. Finally, after he'd finished brutalizing the 5 chosen inmates, he said, "I expect better! I expect perfection! You stupid bitches! All of you! I'd do you all in if I could, you damn worthless imperialist pigs, whores, worthless human refuse!" He yelled in a livid voice, filled with a vitriolic hatred that none of the women could even understand. He personally hated Americans and hated women too. So being over these women allowed him to release his innermost vile side of himself that even his family at home in China had never before seen. "Get up!" he yelled, as the privates picked them up off of the ground, some of their ears and noses now bleeding from the electrocution torture they'd just endured. All the while, the visiting People's Armed Police Chief Sergeant 4th Class and Staff Sergeant stood there silently watching. Random mass punishments set the example of terror to the inmates regarding the PAP's brutal nature, and these in particular were relatively more light punishments that could be meted out upon them. "Dismissed!" yelled the sergeant. Instantly, the inmates scattered, most running into the barracks to get out of the sight of the PAP guards as they now left the block. As the women ran, several came to attend to the bludgeoned, broken women who endured the savage beatdown on electrocution, thereby lifting them to prevent their dazed and weakened bodies from totally collapsing and carrying them back to the prisoner barracks. June was breathing heavily, nearly hyperventilating, feeling pure terror upon watching the 5 women being tortured before her eyes. Alice, the block captain, told her that things like that happened and to not let them break her down and steal her humanity. She had neglected to speak of these things before, but June was finding out fast what her new Laogai life was to be. Alice told her to always do all of her tasks to the best of her abilities when on work detail, and that kitchen duty and sorting were the 2 best jobs in the camp to get put on. In the mornings, that is when they pick the work details, volunteer for food or sorting, if they allow volunteering. Sometimes the corporal does the roll call in the morning. "He is bad, but not like the sergeant," said Alice to June, before getting up onto her elongated bunk boards with the other women, as they all went to lay on their 3-tiered bunks. They smoked cigarettes, chatted quietly, because of the no-talking rules in the camp. Only in the bunk could they talk unless addressed directly or if it was work-related. Some women drank soju acquired on the camp's burgeoning black market, along with cigarettes and extra food. All manner of trade went on before the inmates all went to sleep for the night. One of the women came and offered June a swig of soju from her bowl, seeing as she was new. As each inmate was issued a tin dog bowl-looking half-liter bowl and a plastic spoon for meals, June gladly obliged and drank a decent helping of liquor, which burned going down, but it helped her to somewhat relax as she was in the grips of sheer horror at all she'd seen and been through by this point. She normally didn't even smoke or drink, but now she did what she felt she had to in order to alleviate her mental agony, largely stemming from being split up from her family. The women spoke about all of their experiences, all being relatively new to the facility overall, as it literally was only a 3-day-old camp. The camp itself, it was all constructed rapidly by many Ch1com engineering forces, using prefabricated modular pieces in tandem with the original buildings of the airport, thereby amalgamating them into the current dual-purpose facility of the transit camp and the FOB of the local forces of the coalition. Many spoke about their families, their uncertainty for the future, the vile and outright cruel nature of their captors, and their work details they'd thus far been assigned to. All of the women were well aware that this transit camp was only temporary, as they awaited transport to other destinations. Some were to be exterminated, unbeknownst to them. However, others would be sent for hard labor in Laogai in China, or even in other parts of the new colony of New China. Others yet still would be sold into sexual bondage on the burgeoning Chinese state-sponsored flesh trade. It was a literal lottery of sorts, but of the worst kind, as none were quite sure where they'd go and what would become of them. Some women, like June, would end up being a fairly privileged slave laborer, but she still had to endure life for the time being within the uncertain, brutal confines of the transit camp. Of the women who had been harmed during the roll call, they were being tended to now by other inmates who tried to console them and talk to them and instill in them some kind of hope, which itself was something totally lacking in the current circumstances. A trip to the infirmary would have been denied them anyhow, save if they were deathly ill or had broken bones, as it would literally take that to be able to get into it. June had a cigarette and went to bed, going to sleep on the night of day 3, as it was about to pass into day number 4. End part 26.